Hello viewers, welcome to MOOC's online course on Introducing Indian Art and Appreciation. Today is the second module of the third week, and as you already know, we have dedicated the third week to the understanding of stylistic variations in Indian art, taking up very specific examples. In the first module of this week, we picked up Ajanta as one of the major examples to study the stylistic variations of Indian art. Today, we have selected two very important sculptural sites from Indian art. One, Mamallapuram, or what is more commonly known as Mamallapuram near Chennai, and the other one is very well known sculptural as well as architectural site known as Ellora in Maharashtra near Aurangabad. Now, these two sites also have two very different locations. As you might have already noticed that whereas Mamallapuram is located down south, right on the sea near Chennai, and today it is a very important touristic location in Tamil Nadu. And interestingly, at one point of time, maybe in 6th century, 5th century AD, Mamallapuram was also a very well known port, a very well known historical port which gave entry to lot of traders and merchants and visitors from different parts of the world, and particularly Southeast Asia. In contrast, Ellora is located in the heart of Maharashtra near Aurangabad, also close to Ajanta, which we studied in the previous class, and not very far off from Mumbai. Now, despite the locational differences, these two places have two very different but in a way similar approaches to art. Both of these places have very interesting sculptural carvings dealing with the narrative aspect in a very innovative way. Let us start with Mamallapuram. At Mamallapuram, you find different kinds of architectural structures. You find something like this, which is technically known as structural temple, and in Mamallapuram they are known as the very famous short temples, wherein you may not find very significant narrative sculptures, but you do find lot of sculpted figures on the body of the temple, on the surrounding walls, and also inside the temples, mostly in an iconic formation. Apart from short temples, in Mamallapuram you also have Pancharatha temples, where the temple structures are built following the idea of a ratha. Here too, you do have whole lot of interesting sculptural figures within the temple structure, on the body of the temples, as well as outside the temples, within the temple complex. But what we understand as a narrative panel, where a particular story is being told in terms of unfolding the sequence of events, is yet to happen. And for that, we need to go to a very interesting and a very intriguing narrative panel at Mamallapuram, and that particular narrative panel is known as Descent of Ganges, and at times it is also identified by some scholars as a narrative which is unfolding the story of Arjuna's penance. Now, whatever it is, what we see here is a whole composition crowded with innumerable figures, both human and animals, arranged in a certain way which does not look very organized. In fact, right at the outset, when you look at this particular narrative panel or relief panel from a distance, the composition does not look even very orderly. It looks chaotic, and perhaps this chaotic feeling evoked by this particular narrative structure is the life, is the content of this panel. Now, what I am trying to convey is the fact that though the narrative panel usually is expected to have a story with a beginning and a middle and an end, and every story behind any narrative panel would have that, certainly. But that does not necessarily guarantee that the visual depiction will also follow the same kind of sequence. And this is what exactly is happening in this particular narrative panel called The Descent of Ganges at Mamallapuram. It is, the story is drawn out of the Indian mythology, which describes how Ganges is born out of Shiva's mat, or Shiva's hair for that matter. Now, or matted hair. But the point is, the story, instead of being told in a very orderly sequential manner, is being told in a rather haphazard way, where the entire crowd participates, and this crowd includes human beings, this crowd includes animals, birds, everything under the earth. In that sense, our mythology, in terms of its visual depiction, turns out to be an epic. It assumes an epic proportion where various kinds of elements, living beings, non-living objects, trees, plants, and definitely these very tenderly, very warm, very well sculpted elephants are there, and altogether they make the composition very touching, yes, and at the same time I would say the visual depiction does not look like a prescription or a very obedient kind of translation of the mythology. Here the artist takes the opportunity, the freedom to imagine the mythology visually in his or in their own way. And that is why in this particular narrative panel called Descent of Ganges, it is not surprising that we are able to notice very interesting details like a small little monkey somewhere, maybe a huge elephant somewhere else, or maybe a very self-absorbed sadhu or a mendicant sitting somewhere on the wall. So, it is a narrative panel that needs to be read in details. It is a narrative panel that needs to be seen not only for the sake of its story, but it needs to be seen also for the sake of the world, the visual world, the natural world it offers. As a result, when you look at this narrative panel very closely and carefully and in detail, you tend to not miss out on the fantastic details. So, it is the detailing of various figures, various elements, human figures, animal figures, then the world from the nature, which includes trees and other kinds of stuffs. Now, so I am talking about the way we are supposed to look at this narrative panel. It is not just to not just to read the story, but also to read how the story is being told. And interestingly, from the point of view of composition, the story does not necessarily remain confined within the given wall only. As you look elsewhere within the same complex, but when you take your eyes out from the wall, you won't be surprised if you are able to notice something like this. Two monkeys, perhaps the parent and the child, they are kind of involved in a very, very humanly, very touching, in a very intimate moment. Now, this particular image of two monkeys may not necessarily be a part of the larger narrative, but they become the part of the visual world the artist creates out of that narrative. And this is where these beautiful stone relief works, they go beyond the narrative, they rather surpass the limitations of a narrative and become very enchanting visual configuration. Now, not only outside on the outer wall of the caves or on the mountains, but also inside many of these Mamallapuram caves, you find wonderful relief panels, and some of them which we are going to look at today have very well known stories. So, the stories are not really an issue. The stories might be very well known to us, in fact very popular to us. For example, in this particular inside this particular cave, and this cave is also once again a not natural cave, like Ajanta and Ellora, these caves have been hewn out, carved out, excavated by the sculptors and the architects, man-made caves, and inside the man-made caves you may find something like this, Mahishasur-Mardini, for example. Now, again, this particular relief panel depicting the famous story called Mahishasur-Mardini is not simply a depiction of the story where the goddess Durga is trying to subjugate the demon Mahishasur, because taking the opportunity, or we can also put it the other way, in the pretext of telling this story, the sculptor takes the freedom of including various figures aligning with both sides, either on Durga's side or on Mahishasura's side, and with a kind of gesture and posture and expressions which you may not be finding literally in the stories, but we are sure that these expressions, these postures are imaginations of the artists. So, in these narrative relief panels, instead of simply going by what the mythology or the Purana tells you, the sculptor also takes the freedom, enjoys the freedom of adding his own vision and imagination, and this is what we need to look at when we are looking at these relief panels. Another very important relief panel that we find at Mamallapuram is Krishna lifting Mount Govardhana, which is popularly known as Giri Govardhana. And you may see, if you are looking at this relief panel carefully, that while the Krishna's iconic figure is all right, I mean with his left hand he is lifting the entire hill up to save the mankind, but one must look at the adjacent figures, one must look at the secondary figures, and many of them are there in this huge panel, and look at the identity of each of the figures. You should look at the expressions of each of these figures. You should look at the relationships created between the figures. Whereas Krishna stands upright with his left hand holding the mountain straight up, rest of the figures are really speaking restless, because initially they were very afraid, they were scared of an imminent kind of natural disaster from which Krishna saved their lives. So, they are still carrying that restlessness in their postures and gestures, whereas Krishna, the hero, is unmoved. So, once again we need to look at the details, and while we are looking at the details, our eye will be drawn to very touching details like this, where you can see a cow herd is milking the cow, and the cow is licking his calf, and you can also see rest of the village men and women. So, what Krishna really is saving from the wrath of the nature is not simply the life of human beings, but also the entire village life. So, the sculptor is trying to show everything that Krishna is trying to save, not just symbolically, but by recording, as it were, the daily life of the people who pleaded to Krishna to save their life. So, narrative does not mean, particularly when a narrative is drawn from the Puranic sources, it does not necessarily mean that the sculptor or the painter is simply going to illustrate that Purana. In Indian art, in traditional Indian art, whether it is a sculpture, relief sculpture or painting, in most of the cases, more often than not, sculptors and painters, artists in general, have always felt the freedom. They were always left with a huge scope to visualize, imagine and build up their own ideas in order to translate a given mythology into an enchanting visual configuration. So, in Mamallapuram, you should be looking at all these tender details. Ellora. Ellora should be considered as another very important site, and as I have already mentioned, this particular site, which is a series of almost 34 caves, and the religious context of these caves are also very interesting, because all the caves are not dedicated to one religion. You have caves dedicated to Buddhism, then you have Hindu caves as well as Jain caves. So, it is a wonderful combination and very impressive complex of all these three religions sponsoring and patronizing caves pertaining to their respective religions. So, as a result, we find very interesting architectural constructions hewn out once again by the carvers, and at the same time we get to see some most beautiful sculptures, both iconic sculptures as well as relief panels. Today we are going to focus mostly on the relief panels. Now, this is also true, most of the very fascinating narrative relief panels at Ellora will be found at cave number 16, which is a Hindu cave or a Brahmanical cave, because most of the Buddhist caves will have Buddha statues or the huge figure of Buddha seated or standing, but they may not have necessarily narrative panels. Whereas at Ellora, most of the narrative panels are found at the Hindu caves, and cave number 16, which is also known as the great Kailasha temple or Kailashnath, is famous for that, the narrative panels. So, once you enter the Kailashnath complex, which is cave number 16, along with the narrative panels, you will also come across various figures, single figures. So, maybe a singular figure may not carry a great detail of narration or story components, but when you look at all the single figures in a given complex, altogether they may evoke a story or a narration with a kind of links in between them. But we will be looking at some specific examples of narrative panels. Now, it is true, before we move on to that, just let me show you this photograph, and let me just draw your attention to the fact that we need to imagine, if you have not been there so far, but I strongly recommend that you should go and visit Ellora very soon. And because it is the ambience, the architectural and the sculptural ambience that leaves a great impact and impression on the viewers, and which is very important. So, this is a photograph of that ambience. This is another photograph of that ambience wherein you will find lot of narrative panels. So, now when you begin to focus on some specific narrative panels, you can't also avoid these freestanding singular sculptures of huge elephants. They may not have a very independent narrative of its own, but they definitely add to the narrative ambience of the whole complex. And that is why even when you are focusing on the narrative panel, you simply can't avoid or ignore in your mind the presence of these huge elephants or the presence of the independently carved figures on the wall. Now, we have this very interesting panels, relief sculptures at Ellora, wherein you can see the narrative has been visualized and depicted not on a kind of unidentified background or a space, like the way the first Descent of Ganges relief sculpture at Mamallapuram we saw today does. But here you can see that the narrative panel has been divided into several horizontal panels, smaller horizontal panels, almost like a comic strip. I mean, this particular narrative structure reminds us of the comic strip format, but without the vertical frame divisions. So, it is very interesting that in order to accommodate all the finer details, all the smaller details of the narrative, and in this case it is Mahabharata, sometimes it might be also Ramayana. And you know that these epics, whether it is Mahabharata or Ramayana, they are full of details. Now, how do you show all these details? You can't show them always in a large scale, because you need to show everything. And if you need to show everything, bring them into small scale, divide the larger space into smaller horizontal bands, and this is what exactly they have done over here. A few more slides from the same panel, just to give you an idea what exactly is being depicted. And now I can leave it up to you also to identify the episodes of the story, now that I have told you that these are epics, and particularly this one is Mahabharata. And as you can see, lot of people with bows and arrows, I am sure you can make out already that this must be episodes from the war of Kurukshetra. But what are the further details? For example, this entire wall is full of episodes from Mahabharata. Study this wall carefully and try to identify the episodes from the most well known epic called Mahabharata. So, once again, the story is not very unknown to us. What is unknown to us is to identify the episodes. We may not be able to identify the episodes straight away, because we are not habituated to looking at a visual story without any vertical frames, without any pause. We are more habituated to watching a film or a television serial where things come and go. You may once again come across these individual figures on the walls, and these figures, though they may not have any direct relation pertaining to any particular narrative, but we should not forget to count on them when we are trying to understand the entire narrative structure of that place or the composition of that place. For example, this is a flying Gandharva, which is not so specific in terms of any particular narrative, but the very presence of this kind of figures like flying Gandharva will make the ambience a very sacred one, hence giving certain kind of dimension to the larger narrative. Now, almost following this particular posture of the flying Gandharva, you have something like this. Now, can you identify? Can you identify this particular episode from the story of Ramayana? Of course, you can. You can see how Jatayu is trying to intervene Ravana, while Ravana was trying to abduct Sita and take her away. Now, the tremendous kind of dimension, I mean the physical dimension with which this particular episode from Ramayana has been told here is very telling and enough, powerful enough to evoke the emotion of that moment and also to create that dramatic tension of that episode. Now, just identifying the moment is not enough for us. We also need to learn and understand how to relate with the emotions, the emotional content and also the expressive content of these narratives. For that, you simply need to remember the story and then study the particular sculpture from every possible angle. Similarly, Rama on chariot, look at his gesture, look at the gesture of the horses, look at the space where this particular narrative has been located. Now, this may not be a part of larger narrative, but Rama himself with his bow and arrow on a horse-drawn chariot is an independent and self-sufficient narrative. So, the word narrative itself has undergone certain very significant changes in Ellora, within the history of Ellora. So, similarly, you also have a very well known example of a very rarely seen narrative where you can see Ravana shaking Mount Kailasha. You can see a very restless Ravana below and you can see a very calm Shiva with his consort Parvati right beside him, almost unmoved because they do not simply care. And Ravana is very restless. He wants to destroy Shiva's abode and of course he can't. Hence, you can see a contrast of the dramatic elements, whereas below, because of the restless posture of Ravana, you can see the composition is very restless, extremely dynamic, whereas up there on Mount Kailasha you can see Shiva and Parvati and their people, their entire group seated with a kind of calm, with a kind of carefree attitude which is in absolute contrast with Ravana's posture down below.